Winter on the Haunted Farm, presented by Absolutely Haunted. Have you ever listened to the stories your ancestors told? You know the ones, those whispered around the fading flame of a midnight campfire on the edge of some deep, dark, perhaps dangerous wood. Those haunting tales which are passed down through the generations, the ones that come to rest deep in your own psyche. Those stories that lodge like some trapped bird deep in your own soul. A bird whose frantic movements for freedom stirs up all the terror of the first time you ever heard the tale. This is one of those stories. For that matter, it is my own grandmother's personal story. One from a time when America was in the first throes of the Great Depression. Why don't you just sit back and let me bend your ear to the true story of what happened on a small farm in northeastern Kansas, in the middle of the dark, cold bleakness, which is a Kansas winter. The year was 1930, and my grandmother Opal was 8 years old. Her parents, Frank and Josie, as well as her older sibling Herman, had moved into a vacant rental farm in the last days of a cool, crisp fall, just before the weather turned. Setting up the barns and outbuildings for their animals before winter truly started had kept everyone pretty busy, and she had stated many times over the years that she was grateful when the weather shifted, as it meant less work for her and more free time to play with her dolls. Of course, being trapped inside once the odd occurrences began had made her wish for a reprieve from the horrors and fears found on the inside of the house. It was something that being able to retreat to the outdoors would have provided. Being busy had not kept the family from noticing the start of some strange occurrences, which had began almost immediately after moving in, that consisted of various knocks, thumps and bumps. But the family, trying to be logical, had put the noises down to the home settling, or as the noises of wildlife in the walls of the once-abandoned farm, even when Frank could find no sign of any such critters. Still, that idea kept the small family from dwelling on the incidents until a new phenomena began to happen, and when it did, it was pretty hard to dismiss. You see, objects began to move about the house on their own. Josie was the first to notice the disturbing anomalies when they began. One morning, while making the family's morning meal, she placed a spoon she was cooking with down on the table. When she turned around mere seconds later, the utensil was no longer there, despite looking high and low. This spoon was never seen again. Another occurrence involved a set of hair combs placed on a bedside table at night, which were found to be missing in the morning. The combs were found later that day, lying on the outhouse floor. The family was certainly aware that these instances were strange and certainly not normal. But with tough times going on all over the country and money being extremely tight, the events that had so far presented themselves to everyone seemed like minor instances. Surely they could live with them for now. The family continued to feel that way until the time came to consider what kind of message the axe was supposed to send. What had happened with the axe felt like a threat towards the family. The question being, was it a deadly threat? Frank and Herman had split wood throughout the afternoon, bringing in plenty to last the family for a couple of days. The first snow of the year had begun before nightfall. Little Opal had looked out, scraping the thin ice from the cold window to observe the winter-white snowflakes falling down and gathering upon all the outdoor objects. She always said that she remembered observing the axe was driven deep into the huge stump her father used as a base to split logs. That is where Frank always kept it, so it would always be kept awaiting its next turn at use, so where it ended up was by no means justified. Opal came awake the next morning to overhear her parents in a hushed but urgent discussion. Her father's tone of voice had a strange tension to it, and she could not only hear, but also sense the fear in her mother's frightened replies. It seemed her father had opened the front door that morning on his way to tend the animals. He found to his shock that the axe, icy cold, was thoroughly and deeply embedded into the door of the house. It was as if someone had thrown it at the door from a great distance. Frank knew it had been thrown with a great deal of force, as it had been difficult to extract from the front door. No one in the household had heard anything, or had been disturbed in their sleep during the night. Frank was angry, yet Josie was terrified. Young Opal could hear Frank trying to talk through the rational possibilities of how this incident had happened. Could someone, a human being, or maybe even several, be threatening his family? The mere thought made him angry. Maybe someone else had wanted to rent the abandoned property and were trying to scare his family off. Opal had already been frightened by the minor occurrences going on before this instance, but now she was petrified, feeling a cold, icy fear race up her spine. In the week that followed the axe incident, the family found themselves constantly chasing the strange noises. The thumps and bumps that shook the farmhouse, the bangs that startled the horses, terrorizing them, had not only increased in occurrence but also in intensity. The family now felt as if something was ramping up, yet they did not know what it was magnifying to. The axe had seemed an ominous sign, and for the little 8-year-old, she couldn't help but shiver as she slipped under her quilt. The warmth of her bed did nothing to calm the shivers running over her skin. Opal tried to calm her fears, tried to forget what was happening. She reached out and pulled her doll closer, burrowing her body as far down as she could under the mound of quilts and covers, hoping that nothing could see her under them. Opal was amazed when she woke, realizing that as scared as she was, she must have dozed off. She knew something had awakened her, but she did not know what that something had been. She gazed about the dark room, trying to figure out what had suddenly brought her into consciousness. She had learned enough to know that you should be afraid of this house and of whatever was residing within its walls, especially when you're on your own. Opal remained as still as she could, peeking out from under her blankets, too afraid to move and still trying to decipher what had brought her up from the depths of slumber. She heard them before she saw them. 3 black shadows moving around that were darker than the darkest corners of her room. They occupied the spaces that were farthest from the window, with its pale moonlight filtering through, a moonlight that did not seem to penetrate the strange beings at all. Despite their human shapes, something told her they were not human, at least not now. Her mind questioned had they ever been human at all. What Opal did know was that she dared not to move, watching them for several minutes before suddenly becoming aware that they appeared to be talking to one another. Even though they were in the same room, she could not make out what they were saying to one another, as their speech was low and murmuring, though they appeared to be in a fight among themselves. All 3 dark figures flitted angrily back and forth across the room with a constant motion and aggravation, and although she could only see the shadows, she could feel their anger and rage. She dared not make a peep, aided by the fact her fear had rendered her frozen in body and voice. Opal laid for what seemed like hours, but later said it could have been only minutes. Observing them while completely still, afraid any movement would draw their attention in her direction, she was terrified of what the 3 shadowy figures might do if they sensed she was alert and awake. After a while, she became aware that the light coming in through the window was growing stronger. As the morning light began to fill the room, the shadows froze and ceased their agitated pacing and slowly began to fade away. Once they disappeared, Opal leapt from her bed and rushed into the kitchen where her mum had just entered, calmly tying her apron on, getting ready to start a new day. Opal rushed into the room, falling at her mum's feet. She had never felt fear like that before, and between her frantic shivering and crying, her parents were finally able to make out the story she had to share. Opal felt lucky they believed her immediately. They shared with Opal that they and Herman had been witnessing fleeting apparitions and people who would disappear when approached for the last several weeks, but they had been trying to shield her from knowing about them. Herman came in and shared his story with his little sister soon after. He said that the day before he had been in the barn mucking out the horse pen, when 2 of the hooks they used to gather hay came flying into the pen he was working in, almost hitting him before they lodged themselves into the barn wall. No one but Herman was around when this happened, and he had no idea how those hooks had taken flight, but it scared him enough he immediately told his dad. Josie said that she had seen a woman out near her hen house one morning and, thinking it was one of their neighbours, had called out to the woman. When the woman turned, to Josie's horror, she realised that the woman had no eyes. Suddenly, the eyeless woman ran towards Josie, cursing and screeching before she disappeared in mid-run. Frank told Josie that whatever was happening, it was getting not only more violent with throwing the axe, rushing at Josie, and throwing the hooks at Herman, but now that his little girl had been trapped in a room with 3 entities, he was worried where this could end. Frank knew he had to protect his family, but how could he do anything against something you cannot see or touch when it threatens those he loves? Josie was relieved when she heard Frank say he would go into town and see if he could find another place to move. But in the time being, until he found another place, Frank felt that Josie should sleep in the same room as Opal until they could get out. Frank returned from town just before supper with the best news, as he had been able to secure another place to live. They would be able to move within the week, which eased everyone's minds. During supper, Frank had shared with his family some of the stories he had heard around town about their current home. It seemed that no one stayed in this farm for too long, with many families sharing similar stories and experiences that they themselves now faced. One older gentleman made a comment that even with homes being in shortage and being hard to come by, no one wanted to stay on this particular farm. Frank said winter or not, they would begin the move within the next week. Josie had to admit that she was relieved, and it was with a more peaceful heart that she tucked Opal into bed that night. Just knowing they would leave this unholy house forever by the week's end gave her some measure of peace. She felt she and her family would be grateful when this ordeal was finally over. Even years later, Grandmother Opal's eyes would take on a haunted look of fear. Even though decades had passed, she would always pull her sweater a little tighter, then with horrified eyes recall how her mother and her held each other close as they dozed off that night. They had spent those moments before sleep discussing excitedly about the upcoming move and what was the most logical and quickest way to pack to make their exit from the farm faster. Opal felt comforted knowing her mother was within arm's length of her if she needed her. Still, it did not change the fact that later that night she again found herself suddenly awake. Frightened, she was laying there looking around the room from under the covers and quilts in which she had hid herself before dozing off. She could feel her mum's warm body lying next to her in the soft plushness of the feather-down mattress. Yet still she was scared. Her eyes darted quickly around the room, searching for any reason she had this feeling of dread. Opal could feel the panic rising up from her stomach, but this time she could not see any reason to explain why she felt afraid, why the hairs on her head and arms stood on end. Her mum's soft, measured breathing next to her should have brought her some measure of comfort, but it did nothing to quell the fear she felt. She inched a little closer to her mum as she became aware of a soft, scurrying sound from the wall next to the bed. She traced her eyes up and down the edge of the mattress, thinking a mouse or some animal would suddenly appear. She saw and took in nothing strange, so she paused to squint her eyes, trying desperately to sharpen her vision in the dark of the room. "What is that?" she thought. She could clearly feel movement at the side of the bed, the feeling as if someone else was gently pulling at the top quilt that was covering them, from just over the edge of the feather mattress. Opal continued to frantically trace the edge of the bed with her eyes. When something did appear at first, she was not sure what she was seeing. She blinked her eyes, thinking that this could not be right. Her mind screamed as she made out a set of human fingers, clearly bony and rotten, its skin discoloured a sickly shade of blue and stretched tight with darker patches of open rot. The pale moonlight from the window above where she lay illuminated the hand that was clutching at the quilt. She could clearly see the fingers was using that very quilt to pull the severed hand and what was left of the torn arm onto the very bed on which she and her mother lay. She tried to scream but realised the scream had only came out as a small squeak, fear having stolen her voice. Opal pushed back against her mother's warm body, trying to wake her, as well as to put as much distance between her and the rotting hand as she possibly could. The view she had of the hand confirmed it was blue, with patches of rotted decay, with a smell of something dead filling her nostrils. The nail beds were black and one fingernail was hanging by a small thread of skin. The fingers tugged the remnants of the arm slowly closer towards her across the bed. What was left of the arm was torn and jagged, dripping a foul substance that was leaving trails of a stinking, sticky wetness across the quilt as it was dragged along. The fingers kept inching their way towards her with purpose. Opal gagged from the stench, but could not bring herself to form words. Her hand shot out to push and jab at her mother, who for some reason continued to sleep, totally unaware of the terror taking place just inches from her sleeping form. Opal, in her fear, reached out and grasped her mum's arm and tried to make her touch the severed appendage. Some part of her terror-stricken brain needed to see if it was real. Yet she knew she could never be brave enough to grasp the thing herself. Maybe it would simply disappear if her mother's hand made contact. Before Josie's fingers could reach the stinking hand, it would skitter backwards. It appeared to Opal that the thing was afraid of her mother's touch. The hand shifted and made its approach again. Opal once more repeated the movements with her mother's hand, watching puzzled as the decaying hand again scampered away, once again charging at her from another direction. Opal could not understand how Josie could continue to breathe and sleep so soundly, with her arm being pulled like crazy. But yet she did. The hand had finally retreated to the bottom of the bed, and suddenly, as if it felt this was its last chance, ran with its fingers flying over the blankets. Just as it came up over her covered knees, she jerked her mother's hand toward it, hearing her mother groggily ask, "Opal, what are you doing?" Josie sat up and just caught sight of the severed arm flying on nimble fingers over the quilt towards her child. Her mother's instinct had her immediately slapping it away from her daughter so hard that it flew across the room and hit the bedroom wall. Josie reached out and grabbed her daughter protectively, pulling her back towards the head of the bed. "What was that?" she screamed. When suddenly, without warning, a tall, ghostly man, his face ravaged with rot, a gaping black hole dripping stinking, vile pus from the hole where he should have had an eye, appeared at the foot of the bed. Josie watched in disbelief and horror as in the dim light of the room she could see the fingers of the blue hand as it grabbed hold of the dead man's pant leg and swiftly climbed its way up to sit upon his shoulder just above where it used to be attached. Suddenly, the gaunt figure lunged for the little girl with a swift movement, using the single arm he still had that was still attached to his frame. He grabbed at Opal as he bellowed, "Give me the girl!" Both mother and daughter screamed. Instantly, the man and the hand resting upon his shoulder disappeared, as if they had never been there. Frank bolted into the room, full of anger and ready to fight, as he had heard the male voice booming out in its demand for Opal. No one was going to hurt his baby. A full, bright and frosty morning found the first load of household items moving down the cold, bleak winter road. Frank had sent Herman out at first light on one of the horses to request some help from some of their local friends, who kindly came along and wound up helping them move everything within a single day. The family never returned to that haunted farm for any reason. Frank always said that he did not like to have to pass that old place from the road, and he was more than grateful when he moved his family from the area. Years later, when Opal visited a friend from the old town, she found out that the owner of the property was so fed up with not being able to keep tenants there, he burned down the property and ploughed the land under. Who was the spirits who haunted the old farm? What did they want with a small girl? We will never know.